Hi, welcome to another Anchor Point research presentation. Today I'm going to talk to you about a piece of research that we've been doing in the School of Psychology, University of Plymouth, which has been looking at the experiences of grandchildren who have had relatives with a brain injury caused by stroke or brain tumour. So this was a project that myself and Dr. Sue Jackson did alongside Emily Sapsford and Emily Ravenhill, two students that we were working with a couple of years ago. And we're about ready to try and get this paper published. So what we were interested in was looking at breaking down the participant groups and looking at whether there were any similarities or differences across different client groups with brain injury and how this impacted on family life. So we had two different groups, brain tumour, and stroke. There had already been previous literature looking at traumatic brain injuries, so they weren't included in this particular study. And what we were interested in was finding out what those experiences looked like, as we know from the research already that family members often feel that they are ignored and forgotten, and that actually, despite the fact that they are involved in the day-to-day care of relatives, they're quite often overlooked in the process. So we wanted to see what the experiences might be of wider family members. So what we wanted to see particularly here was whether that degree of separation would make a difference. So we now understand a reasonable amount about the impact on direct family members who have had a loved one with a brain injury. And what we wanted to then do was have a look at the grandchildren's perspective. So the research that we undertook employed an interpretive phenomenological analysis. This is a specific qualitative methodology that is designed to try and understand the lived experiences of individuals and then comparing those experiences across a range of different individuals. We conducted a series of semi-structured interviews on Zoom with various different participants. In total, we had 15 individuals whose grandparents had had either a brain tumour or a stroke. Of these, 8 had brain tumours. Most of the participants were aged under 18 at the time when the brain tumour or the stroke first was diagnosed or took place, but were adults when they were talking to us as part of the research. So the 4 key themes that we identified from the literature were ambiguous loss and grief, protected by family members, secondary impacts on the family unit, and barriers to accessing support. And I'm going to talk through each of those in turn for the rest of this presentation. So the first finding was around this idea of ambiguous loss. So this is something that is familiar to some people who are aware of the literature around people's experiences of brain injury and family members. So ambiguous loss is a process that people go through when they feel that they are grieving for the loss of an individual, even though that individual is still present in their lives in some way. So what we tend to see in brain injury is that people who have experienced brain injury themselves experience ambiguous loss through a grieving process of the person that they once were. But it's not unusual for family members to also experience that sense of ambiguous loss, mainly as a result of the cognitive, behavioural and emotional changes that the person, their loved one with the brain injury, undertakes, meaning that they're left with a person that looks exactly like the person they loved before, but is in many ways very different. And certainly this was something that the grandchildren were identifying as having similar feelings of this ambiguous loss, as that described in other family members in the wider literature. The second theme, which looked at this idea of protected by family members, focused on this idea that individuals identified that they often felt that they were being protected by older family members, particularly their parents. And while they viewed this as being well-meaning, it was intended as a way of protecting them from the more traumatic experiences that might be going on with their grandparents. It often led to them feeling more isolated and confused, and actually left them feeling like they weren't part of the family unit. So one of the messages that we received very clearly from the participants was the need to have been more actively involved during the process, so that they were able to understand what was going on for their grandparent and actually process that information in real time. One of the things that was really interesting that came out of the next theme, secondary impacts on family units, was looking at how the family structure changes over the course of one of these events taking place. So not only do you have a situation where the grandparent is now experiencing a brain tumour or a stroke, you have the parents who are then having to dedicate more care time to the parent who's unwell. And this inevitably means that there is less time for the relationship between the parent and the child to develop. It causes friction within that relationship, and it also means that there's less caring support from the individual's parents day to day. One of the other things that was noted was that parents quite often are experiencing things like mood swings, and when you think about this coupled with the protected by family members theme, we can see that what's happening here is that family members are deliberately withholding information about the brain tumour or about the stroke from their children in order to protect them. But this means that then potentially their emotional behaviour or their outbursts are less understandable by their child, and so therefore perhaps can be more traumatic to them in the long term. The final theme was around barriers to accessing support. So lots of the literature around family support following acquired brain injury demonstrates that family members rarely get the support that they need to deal with their own experiences of trauma as a result of what they've been through. This was made worse by the situation with grandchildren, because they were that much further removed from the situation, so they had little to no contact with healthcare professionals involved in the care of their grandparents, and so therefore didn't receive any kind of support. And actually many of them expressed a sense that they didn't feel like they were able to ask for it, because it was important for them to show a united front and to be brave in the face of the adversity in order to help their parents cope more effectively with what's happened with their grandparents. So this slightly complex diagram demonstrates the interactions between these different themes. So we have our ambiguous loss and grief theme on the left-hand side here. This was linked to this idea of complicated grief. So what we often see in the case of ambiguous loss is that it makes the grieving process more complex. It takes longer for the grieving to be processed. And part of this was then linked to this idea of barriers to accessing support, where people felt that they didn't have permission to ask for support, and thus also didn't have permission to grieve for their relative. There was these aspects that I've already discussed around a loss of the relative who they used to know from before, and a change in the relationship dynamic with that individual. And this linked then to the second theme, which was around protected by family members. So what we were seeing was that individuals who were children were struggling to make sense of what was going on around them. And because they were having information withheld from them, they felt that there was always some secrets going on in the background, which made it difficult for them to understand the nature of the situation. Secondary impact on the family unit. We employed this sub-theme, of the ripple effect as part of this analysis, because this is very much in keeping with what we talk about in Anchor Point, this idea of the ripple effect, that the impact of the brain injury is not just felt by the individual, it's also rippled out to the family members, and in this case further than the immediate family members and into the wider family network. We see that there is a wide emotional impact of the diagnosis and the symptoms on wider members of the family unit, so grandchildren expressing that they are impacted by this as well. And as I've already talked about, the relationships with other family members, particularly parents, are impacted by the brain tumour or the stroke. In terms of the barriers to accessing support, as well as feeling that they were unable to give themselves permission to process and grieve for their grandparent who was, there was also a sense that there was stigma associated with support, and therefore there was very much a kind of keep calm and carry on approach taken by all of the participants in our study. So to conclude, what we can tell from this research is that not only do those immediate family members experience those losses, and changes in their family system as a result of a relative's illness, but that this impact ripples out further than that to to all the family network, including those individuals that are not primary family carers. What we see then is that this loss, combined with unmet information and support needs, so withholding of information about what's going on with the grandparent and no outside support, is more likely to lead to the grandchildren experiencing complicated grief long term and finding it difficult, therefore, to process this trauma that they're being witness to. We're hoping that this study will offer something new to the literature, as there are very little in the way of studies that have looked at that wider impact on the family outside of immediate carers, and this helps to identify exactly how we need to take a more family systems approach in supporting individuals with brain injury and their families. If you're interested in hearing any more about the presentation, then please do contact me, Ali Norman. My contact details are available by Googling me. I'm happy to share any findings about the research for future reference.